Cool. Thank you. So hello. I'm really excited to be here. Before we begin, I just kind of want to state this. For what I'll be discussing today, which is inclusive design and accessibility and disability, you might hear some things that challenge your view of the world or your sense of identity. And I ask you to listen with a sense of curiosity and an open mind. It's also a two-way street. If I use terminology that you use, you may take issue with, please reach out to me after the talk so that I can learn from you and your perspectives. Just again, thank you for the privilege and the opportunity to come speak with you today. A little bit about me. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a designer at a company called AdHoc. We work on healthcare and Medicare.gov, as well as the VA. I write for CSS Tricks and Smashing Magazine and a few other places. I help maintain the A11Y project, more on that for a bit. I contribute to the MDN Mozilla Developer Network for Accessibility. I'm in Somerville. If you're in the area, happy to buy you coffee. And again, just really happy to be here. The A11Y project, as I mentioned, is an open source, community-driven effort to make digital accessibility easier. And there's a lot of nuance that lives within doing accessible design and development, and we're trying to help demystify it. That includes some posts and a checklist and some resources, kind of like a one-stop shop. So if that's something you're interested in, I definitely recommend checking it out. I used to do freelance accessibility auditing for a company called Tenon. So I have done this in a capacity that is legally binding. Basically, it converts to expert witness testimony. So this is a thing that you can do as a person who is interested in technology, but also just kind of be aware that this sort of thing exists and you can do it. The MDN Web Docs, if you're not familiar, is a great knowledge base for basically anything front-end developer focused. One of the things I was very proud to do was introduce accessibility concerns into certain technology features, with the idea being that you can meet people where they are, as opposed to having to find obscure blog posts that you may not even know the right terminology to search for. So to kick us off, what is accessibility? It's many things to many people, and I'm going to help give you my understanding and definition of it. First off, in the United States, accessibility is a civil right. The photo here is from the Capitol crawl, which happened in 1973. And disability activists actually abandoned their assistive technology to crawl up the steps of the Capitol in DC, basically protesting discrimination based on disability. Because of this, the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities was founded in 1975. Of note, this is the first disability rights group that was created, governed, and administered by disabled individuals. It's also the first ever national group that basically pulled together disparate kind of organizers. And when I say civil right, I mean that this is a protected class, much as how we are granted protections not to be discriminated against our race, our religion, our sexual preferences. This is one of the most important, most powerful laws in the land. What is accessibility? This is a textbook description. Accessibility is the design of products, devices, services, or environments for disabled people, by which I mean I have a Better Touch trial that is expiring, and I will continue my trial. I don't know if you saw that. So what we mean here is, for somebody who is biologically or environmentally disabled, this is the specific and deliberate creation of accommodations so they can navigate both the built environment of the world as well as digital services. You may not be able to, say, use a mouse if you have full body paralysis. There are techniques you can do in design and development that accommodate the way that they navigate the world. So it's removing access barriers. If you have like a set of staircase for access, you can have a ramp instead. That way everybody can use it, but it is specifically designed and targeted for people who would be using a wheelchair to access a building. Another kind of terminology you might see thrown around. So accessibility and A11Y, the A11Y project, this is what's called a neuronym, where basically it's a shortening of the term accessibility down into A11Y, 11 characters between A and Y. And this is shorthand that basically means digital accessibility. And this helps to clarify what we're talking about, because access can be, say, access to a library or access to a grocery store. This specifically means access to a website. So if you ever see this thrown around, know that this is a way to quickly kind of disambiguate, like, yep, nope, we're talking about digital accessibility. Cool, great. So, how do we do this? How do we make an accessibility happen? In very broad strokes, there are 4 governing principles for the mindset for accessibility. First is perceivable, and this is part of a 4-letter acronym called POUR, P-O-U-R. Perceivable is basically the guiding principles. Is there anything on a website that a blind, deaf, low vision, or colorblind person would not be able to perceive? For operable, the second letter in the acronym POUR, can all the functions of a website be performed with a keyboard? Can users make control of interactive elements on our website? Does our website make completing tasks easy? If you have a web audio player such as Spotify, can you use the space bar to play and pause music the same way you can click on it? That's what operable is like. Understandable, this one's my favorite. Is all the text clearly written? Are all the interactions easy to understand? I'm sure all of you are familiar with like a frustrating web experience where you don't know what they're asking of you or how to do it. This is actually a tenet of accessibility. If you are not kind of familiar with like a esoteric or complicated interaction, like you might be conditionally disabled because they are just making no sense and they're failing to meet your needs. I just saw the chat. Oh yeah, thank you. So an environmental disability is, there's the notion, I'll get into this in a little bit, biological. So you are born or an event happens and something happens to your body where you are disabled. So like a good example here is, say you have limb loss, you no longer have your arms, one or both of them, that's considered a biological disability. An environmental disability is something the built environment does to you. So like a really good example of this is there's a fire and there's a lot of smoke, and your capacity to breathe and therefore your cognition and like your ability to see what's in front of you, that is disabling you from, operating the way you normally would. And so like, it's a very kind of subtle thing, and I'll get into it in a little bit, but does that kind of provide a little bit more context? Great, thanks. So our 4th in the POUR is robust. And this is another one of my favorite ones, which is one of the cool things about the web is I can open a website made in 1995 and it'll work. And I think that's something that a lot of people take for granted, but it's really huge and it's really powerful, because the same way you can open that old website and it works, you can open it on a bunch of different browsers. You can interface with it with a bunch of different technologies. There's software such as voice control, which allows you to navigate and edit content on the web. And that's robust. It's more than just a mouse. It's more than just a keyboard. It will work with whatever kind of augmentation you throw into it. These 4 principles tie into what is called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is an international standard. So when I do auditing it ties back to law, and this law is governed by the WCAG. It's very dense, it's very technical. Hopefully you will never have to read it, but kind of the principles that I'm outlining here are help to shape, a way to go about doing accessible and inclusive design. So that being said, what is inclusive design versus accessibility? So accessibility is providing accommodations specifically for disabled folks. Inclusive design is a little bit different, a little bit the same. What it does is, I'm going to ask the uncomfortable questions here, and hopefully this will help to kind of provide a context of what disability is. How do you self-identify? Are you wearing glasses? Do you have depression, or have you ever felt anxious? Do you have anxiety? And will you get old one day? So basically, disability in the context of inclusive design is a minoritized group that eventually everyone will enter into. I'm wearing glasses. That is technically low vision. That is technically a disability category. So really what inclusive design probes at is recontextualizing. So disability here, temporary sickness is a temporary disability. That's a really good call out. If you have the flu, you can't really get out of bed. You can't really think, you're clouded. That affects your cognition, and it affects your mobility. My favorite other one is if you're hungover or drunk, you're temporarily disabled because your motor control is less fine. Your problem solving abilities are diminished, kind of the same way you're sick. So disability in the context of inclusive design is a mismatch between an individual and their environment. But which I mean, this is called the social model of disability instead of the medical. The medical model is basically people are a problem to be solved. So you have a condition and it's up to us to fix you and makes you better. Within the social model of disability, we challenge the systems and the built environment around us. And why aren't they built accessible by default? Why do we use stairs instead of gradual ramps for access to buildings? Why do we put the onus on somebody in a wheelchair to call ahead to make sure that there's access to a building? Why do we make websites inaccessible by default, knowing that this is a thing now? So there's basically what the thrust of this is there's many ways to live and work in the world, and we should accommodate them. And one of the reasons we do this is to help prevent othering. I may think of myself as abled and not a disabled person. And when I make that distinction, it starts to become an us versus them thing. And that's a very easy way to write off these concerns. So what we kind of do is we think about it as impairment, either temporary or permanent. And that's something that can happen to everyone, including myself. But also, you want to understand that it's not just about me. Like, we can think about this selfishly, but it can be, yourself, it can be your family, it can be your friends, it can be their family and friends. And basically what this is the phrase solve for one, extend to many. So the more you kind of think about and make accessibility improvements to what you work on, this has a ripple effect. It helps, more and more people. And, you may not be there for them to know that you helped them out, but it really does have this cumulative effect. And that's something I'm really into. Inclusive design is also a new way of looking at an old idea. And this is a bit of a history lesson. So in the 50s, the Air Force was having trouble with pilots dying because they couldn't control their jets. And this is not like feel-good feelings of helping people out. It's expensive to train pilots, and it's expensive to make aircraft. And so the military really isn't into feelings, but they wanted to solve this because they wanted to not have dead pilots and expensive jets getting crashing and burning. And so basically what they did is this really cool thing. They said, we're gonna, make a cockpit for the average pilot, because if the average pilot is comfortable, that means they're going to be a little bit more responsive in the cockpit, and that means we're going to lose less planes and less pilots. And so they measured 4,000 pilots on 140 dimensions, and created an average and kind of instituted this idea of like, okay, we're going to build a cockpit, put it in a jet for the average pilot. And the poor performance continued. And an individual named Gilbert S. Daniels disagreed. And he basically said, like, if you solve for the average, you're solving for no one. And he proposed this thing called individual fit, which is the environment needed to suit the person in it and not a mythical average individual. And so he was like, let's put straps and buckles and like levers in here so you can move the seat around and adjust things to be more comfortable to yourself. And not only was this cheaper to institute with mass production, but it actually improved pilot survival rate. And this kind of extends into the modern world where, you know, things you can adjust to make yourself more comfortable, the seat in your car, you know, adjusting your rear view mirror on a website, you can knock the font size up and down. You can, on your operating system, you can put color filters in. This kind of customization allows people to, you know, create an environment that works for them. And this is really kind of a guiding principle of inclusive design. Inclusive design is universal design. This is in 1997, so pretty recently. Basically, a architect called Ronald Mace was like, hey, we should think about buildings in a way that, you know, is more than just white men that can walk freely can actually access the environment. This led to a lot of things in the ADA, which is why buildings now can accommodate wheelchair users in the bathroom, why doors, you know, can be operated with more than just their handles, stuff like that. And then kind of continuing on this, inclusive design is also intersectional. So this is a social theorist, Kimberly Crenshaw, first coined this term in 1989. So again, pretty recent. And intersectionality is kind of acknowledging the fact that individuals present different identities in different contexts. So the way you act around your family is different than the way you act around your friends, is different than the way you act in work. You are still you. It's just the way you kind of behave is affected by your environment. And the reason this is like relevant to inclusive design is because its goal is to avoid to avoid addressing injustice in one group, perpetuating system of inequities to other groups, by which I mean it's like you strive to not make overly generalizing statements, oversimplifying concepts that erase someone's self-identity, also to understand the space that you operate in. For example, this talk I'm giving right now, to understand other people's points of views and how to take actions in the systems that affect you. So what inclusive design does in this context is it challenges access barriers, but also importantly, discrimination. Accessibility is specifically for disabled people and kind of making the built environment accessible to them. Inclusive design also understands the greater context of the world you live in. And so like you can be affected by discrimination. That doesn't necessarily mean you're disabled, but it does mean that it is something that you should be empowered to change. A really good example of this on the web is, you know, if a form that you need to fill out asks you for your gender, and it only has a male, female kind of binary, that's not really reflective of the way the world works. And, you know, that's one of those things inclusive design can push against. So how do we do this? How do we do inclusive design? How do we do accessibility? Miguel, any specific innovative tools to help improve education and communication between the disabled and the not disabled? If you don't mind, I'm going to punt on that because I'm going to get to it. So kind of carrying on here, how do we do inclusive design and accessibility? There are kind of 7 principles. These are the inclusive design principles. And the first is kind of providing a comparable experience. And so think about the interface that you have, and then, how can you accomplish the task that the interface is asking you to do without undermining the quality of the content? A really good example of this is Touch ID, or touch to unlock on a phone. You can enter your password manually, or you can use your fingerprint. And both of these allow you to access your device. This is actually assistive technology in that it is making it easier for you to get to the thing you want to use. Consider situation is kind of the next guiding theory, which is people use your interface in different situations. And make sure that this works for them regardless of those. And a really good situation kind of to think about here is good color contrast. So using dark type against a light background or vice versa, because that means that like I can read it at my desk indoors and it's fine and it's comfortable, but I could also take it out onto my phone and the sun at noon is overhead and there's a lot of glare, but because the text is very visible, I'm still able to read it and I get what I need. Be consistent. This one's pretty easy, but it's important to note. So, the reason you can click on a link because it's underlined, that's consistency. A lot of websites have it. It's a very easy way to say, I can go to take you to a place. Same way, like a button looks like a button. You can tap that and oop, it does a thing. Cool. That's something we take for granted, but there's a lot of power in making things familiar and understandable. Give control, prioritize people, and basically make sure that they can interact with content in their preferred way. A really good example of this is, I can swipe to delete an email on my own, but what if I can't swipe? Like, what if I have hand tremors and I'm unable to hold my hand down or my finger down on the phone and create this really fine motor control action? I can also tap an edit mode to select an email and delete it. And that's something I can do without needing to make a fine motor gesture or by using something like voice control software. So different ways to let people get what they need. Offer choice. Basically, just different ways for people to complete tasks. So you might be familiar with this in education, where if there's a timed exam, you can ask for accommodation and get more time added for the duration. And that's to meet your needs. Kind of on the web, a really good way of this is like, offering multiple ways to like learn about a product. So you might have like an info sheet, or you might have some marketing copy, just different ways for somebody to kind of understand the concept you're trying to communicate with them. Prioritize content. This is another kind of one we take for granted, but like make the main point of something the main point of something. And that helps people understand what you're trying to do and what you're trying to say. So like for news, don't bury the lead. Tell somebody like what happened up top and then explain why it happened. If you have an app that does a function, make that function like the main point. A good thought, a good way to think about this is I open my weather app and it doesn't give me a 12-page essay about why weather exists. It just tells me, is it sunny out today? Yes or no, will there be a thunderstorm? And that gives me the information I need right up front. And add value. This one is another one of my favorites, which is not only how can you meet somebody's needs, but how can you do it in a effective and compelling way? And this is, in my opinion, this is just good design. I think they threw that in there kind of for that reason. But, when you create a feature, consider kind of the overall context of the app and the world you're bringing it into. So like, does this actively help people, or may it be used as a tool for harm? This is a good question to ask yourself before you spend all this time and energy and money to actually develop the feature itself. So the other thing you'll probably run into in your future careers for development is the vinegar and honey kind of theory of accessibility, which is, if you haven't heard of it, you will most likely hear of it in a legal context. You can be sued for making an inaccessible app or an inaccessible website. And this is a good thing because, again, it is a civil right. And the same way you can sue if you can't enter a building, a public building, because they don't make access for you, you can sue for a website. A very public case for this was actually Domino's. It was this multiple year dragged out, multi-million-dollar thing where somebody couldn't order pizza. And, you might kind of roll your eyes at that. But like, again, I kind of remind you, this is discrimination. They're basically saying that some individuals are not, we don't want them to order pizza. And it's because it's a civil right, you can change that sentence up to say, like, we, Domino's, do not want to sell pizza to women. And that's effectively what they were saying. So when this lawsuit happened, it's basically challenging that notion. That being said, it is a very negative kind of thing to have happen at your place of work. Nobody really likes being told that the thing they did is bad, especially if they didn't know that it was something they needed to think about. And so kind of like what I like to do is, instead of make people feel bad about it, I like to appeal to opportunity. The American Institute for Research did a report called The Purchasing Power of People with Disabilities. And there is an estimated 490 billion with a B dollars in kind of revenue opportunity for companies that acknowledge disability. And part of this report is, the methodology is their notion of what disabled means. Most Americans have some sort of form of disability under the social model. They just may not consider themselves as having it. A really good example here is depression, which is technically a cognitive disability. And that affects, your ability to make decisions and process information. And I don't know about you, but a lot of Americans are pretty depressed these days. The other thing, Miguel, is there a standard grievance checklist for developers? Yes, there is. So the A11Y project has a checklist, and that covers a lot of the very kind of general common things you'll see. So that I very much encourage you to check that out. It's written in plain language, and it also links to the specific kind of legal portions of the standard I mentioned, if you are so inclined to read the complicated technical version. Thank you, Elena. And so, like, the other compelling thing is, again, a history lesson here. This is the Hansen writing ball. It was invented by the Reverend Ramses Milling Hansen, the principal for the Royal Institute of Deaf Mutes in Copenhagen. And he did this in the 1800s. And what this is this is actually the first keyboard. So, like, if you're on a laptop right now, look down at that keyboard. This is assistive technology that has been normalized into the mainstream. And if you think about that, like, you start to kind of have this lens of, oh, okay, cool, wow, yeah, the more we make accommodations mainstream, the more they get kind of filtered into society, and the more we don't think about them that way. Are there any tests we can run to see if our code qualifies the accessibility test? Yes. There will be some resources I'll share. There are automated checks you can do to capture common accessibility issues. You can even install them into GitHub to run automatically for PRs, which means that you don't really have to think about it, and you have a little robot that will yell at you if you need to change something. I love them. The other thing I'd like to mention is there's a bit of a war going on right now with the accessibility community. There are companies that use what are called accessibility overlays, companies such as Accessibility, Audio Eye, and Max Access. And they claim to use AI to improve your website to make it more accessible for disabled people. What they actually do is spy on you and break websites. I have given expert testimony about this. I can give you the PACER code if you want to look it up. Basically, you can't automate these things away because a lot of this boils down to understanding specifically what decisions you're making. So these kinds of companies are trying to exploit ignorance to turn a profit, and you should avoid them at all costs. So what you can do instead is you can do prototyping. And within prototyping, there is the notion of kind of shift left methodology. So here, the thinking is ideas are cheap, execution is not. So with shift left, you kind of have this thing where if you target these concerns earlier on, you start to think about like how an individual who can't use a mouse would use this idea. That saves you a whole lot of time where, it's time to release at the 11th hour and you have so many more pages and so much more logic. And, you really just instead, you kind of start to think about it early and often. The other thing to think is you live in a bubble, but that's okay. So again, you want to test your ideas early and often, but you also want to test with a diverse range of backgrounds. This includes, people who identify as disabled, but also people who are just not like you. And this basically gives you a way to kind of question your biases, directly and indirectly, and make sure that you're thinking of all the things you need to think of. And also having people tell you because you may not know everything. The other thing, and this is kind of a funny one to me, is keep this up after you launch, because websites and apps are very organic. They change and they evolve and they grow over time. So you want to keep your testing going to make sure that you're still on the right path. A little bit more history here for inclusive design. Again, planes. I don't know why I'm so obsessed with World War II and planes for this, but they're really good lessons. So in World War II, again, the military doesn't care about feelings. It cares about not losing money and not losing wars. Pilots' survival rates were really, really low. They didn't like this. So again, they turned to statisticians to be like, why are our planes, crashing and getting shot down? And they were like, well, the armor on them isn't good. And so they said, we're going to get some planes that come back. We're going to look at where all the bullet holes are, and we're going to put armor on those bullet holes areas. And they did. And they sent the planes out, and nothing changed. And it took a guy named Abraham Ward, and he worked for, I guarantee this is a thing, the Department of War Math. It was his idea to say, we're only seeing the planes that come back. We're only seeing the survivors. So instead of putting the armor on the places where there are bullet holes, put it on the place where there aren't, because those are the planes that are getting shot down. And he did, and they did, and the survivability rate went up. And this is a thing that ties deep into human psychology. We don't like to think about failure, and we never see basically the people that we've let down and locked out. So when you're thinking about this in the context of disability, when you're thinking about this in the context of, an intersectional kind of thing, does your app, does your product, does your website, are people physically even able of getting through the front door? A really sad example of this is a lot of job application websites are inaccessible. And you don't get disabled job applicants because they literally can't apply for jobs using your platform. That's an example of survivor bias. Personas. Elena, if you have talked about personas, I'm sorry, I'm about to blow it up. Be very careful about them because, they take individuals in a group and try to blend them together into something you can target as a marketing kind of thing. And by this, I mean, this is where a persona can go wrong. We have two individuals who are both male, 70 years old, English, has children, they're wealthy, they're married, they've remarried, they own real estate, they like to take vacations in the Alps, they like to listen to music, and they like dogs. This is a persona, but this is also Prince Charles and Ozzy Osbourne, who are two radically different people. So instead of trying to generalize individuals into groups that you kind of easily target, you got to really do the work to talk to individuals who use your stuff. Don't make assumptions about how and why they do, and figure out their motivations instead. The reason I had a candy bar here is because, tell me the persona for somebody who wants to buy a candy bar. Like, most people want candy bars. You got to talk to them in the moment to figure out why exactly they did it. Were they bored in the checkout line? Were they hungry? you can't really uncover these kinds of things just by making generalities. The other thing, and this is going to get into Miguel's question from earlier. So another history lesson: in 1956, an Aboriginal elder in the outback of Australia, Nyari Morgan, saw, without any prior context or any knowledge, a atomic bomb explosion from an atomic bomb test. This is an individual who was mostly, actually was completely disconnected from the modern world. And the first encounter he saw with it is an atomic fireball. And by which I mean is, we can't understand this. We cannot come to terms with the lived experience that he went through. And this is an extreme example, but it's one that I think kind of proves the point of empathy only takes you so far. The other thing is Nyari Morgan's first contact with modern society was 7 years later, and it was a white man doing a survey. And this is how we found out about this incident. And so that is a life that is very, very, very difficult to understand on a deep and fundamental level, which is why, I think representation is so important. So if you do testing, make sure that you include individuals with lived experiences. A great practical example of this is you can learn how to use a screen reader. I have some familiarity, but I can turn it off. I have the privilege of being able to turn it off, and I don't use it every day. I don't know the tips and tricks and techniques. And if you talk to individuals who use it every day, it is a very different thing. And a good way to think about this is all the little muscle memory you have for navigating through the web, all the little command control shortcuts and habits that you build up. These individuals have these and they have preferences. And the only way you're going to understand that is if you reach out and you talk to them. The company I have here, I'm a big fan of because they do exactly just that. They do usability testing, but with disabled people first and foremost. And they tell you how they think of this, not only as they can use it, but if it's pleasurable, if it's intuitive, if it's easy for them to use, which is good design. I'm going to pause for water. So, okay, cool. A lot of history, a lot of planes. How do we actually do this? And before we get to code, use plain language. Text is awesome if you make your words simple, if you get rid of weird concepts and break complicated things down. That goes a long way to helping a lot of people out. For your user experience, make sure your information architecture makes sense. So if I go to learn more about the company, they have a little section that says about us. That makes sense to me. I can learn more about what this company is by clicking about us. Test your stuff. So put it in front of real people. Take your prototypes early and often. Make sure that makes sense. People will tell you something's broken and potentially how to fix it for cheap or free, and that's awesome. Put the main point first. So if I'm going to buy a car, put that price up high because I want to know how much this thing is going to cost me. Negative space, you want to make sure that not everything is crammed together. So chunks of stuff are easily understood to be chunks of stuff. So a heading, some body copy, an image, make sure that they're not all crammed real close together. Use obvious and interactive focus indicators. So put a big bright ring around anything that I can click on, because if I shift to it with a keyboard, I want to know where it is, especially if I have low vision. And then, put those important actions high up, potentially even repeat them if they're important enough. You want easy ways for people to understand what the most important stuff is on a per page basis or per kind of view. Refine your typography. Don't use a lot of fonts. Use a pretty good body font size. I like 20 pixels, 16 is okay. Make sure that that's font, is pretty easy to read. You don't want to underline stuff that isn't links because, again, underline equals links on the web. When you make type size adjustments, make sure that it's predictable. So there's a sense of cohesion. this is kind of ties into cognitive accessibility concerns where the more things kind of feel like they don't belong, the more it can potentially confuse people. There's some good resources for typography for developers that I can include with this talk as well, so don't panic. There's a lot of stuff out there to help you out. Your color choices. Make sure that you're using a nice, good color contrast ratio. Again, this helps people with low vision actually see and therefore be able to read your stuff. If you're using just color to convey meaning, a really good example of this is just using red text to indicate an error. If I have red-green color blindness, I may not know that's an error. So, including an icon or making sure that your error message actually explicitly says it's an error and how to fix it. Be really careful with text over complicated backgrounds. Flat design is really in vogue right now, but just make sure that, like, say, an image background with text over it, like, there's a really good way to distinguish the background from the text. And then, like, using restraint with your color palette, you can start to build up understanding of functionality. So, like, if all your links are blue throughout the site, it can go, oh, blue equals go place. And if all your buttons are green, you go like, oh, green does thing. And if all your text is like dark gray, you're like, I can read this, but I can't do stuff. Again, this sounds pretty simplistic, but what you're doing is you're building an internally consistent vocabulary that's really, helps people kind of predict what things are going to do and how they can use it. Your forms. The web is built on forms and nobody likes to talk about it. Basically, every input, make sure it has a visible label that's programmatically associated. So you're going to use your label element to pair with an input. Make your required fields obvious. Ideally, all your forms are obvious. You're not asking extraneous questions. Make sure your error and success states are really easy to understand. So, if you have valid input, maybe you have a little green check mark next to it to say, like, yep, that's what we wanted. And if you don't have good input, maybe a red X with that says this isn't good and here's what we want instead. Don't make filling out a form a arduous long form task that, like, you have to scroll 3 million times to get to the bottom. Break things up into logical sections. So if you're collecting information about an individual, we do this with healthcare.gov. First maybe ask them their name, then maybe ask them their phone number and email address. That's the second of 2 chunks where you're learning about a person. Third might be their address. Fourth might be, other information we may need to collect. That keeps like with like, and it also doesn't exhaust somebody by, like, thinking they need to tackle the whole thing in one go. Again, don't ask for redundant information. The good way to think about this is if you have, say, arthritis or motor control concerns where it just is painful to operate something, don't ask for the same thing twice. We already know this. We already, know this information about you. We should do the hard work to make sure we capture that and put it in the right place. There are good template examples. I would go to the MDN for, especially for form inputs. And I think in the resources for this talk, I will include them, Miguel. And then this one is, again, kind of like, it happens, but you'd be surprised. Put your submit button last and make sure it's very obvious. And because like, somebody's going to work top to bottom through a form and they expect that to be there. Next up is, like, refining your media. The more complicated you have interactions you have and components that you have, the more there's a potential for an access issue. There's also a potential for, somebody just raw being too confused for how to operate it. Again, I'm sure you've all had that experience where it's just like, this is too complicated. I'm going to nope out because I just can't be bothered to figure it out. So take your complicated interactions, break them down into smaller pieces, try to make it as simple as possible. When I say, like, ensure media can be accessed in multiple ways, a good example of this is, if you have a video player, can you tab to it using the tab key on your keyboard? Can you use the space button to play the media, so the video or the audio? Can you use the space button to pause it? If you can't, go back and rework it. You can use the button element for that with some JavaScript logic. And that means that somebody with a mouse can use it the same way somebody with a screen reader can use it, the same way somebody with voice control can use it. That's really cool. Make those animations don't autoplay at start, provide a play pause button. And the reason for this is vestibular conditions can be very heavily triggered by autoplaying stuff, as well as a trigger for migraines and ADHD. There have been instances of people like getting migraines and throwing up because the animation on a website was too complicated. It created a sense of vertigo. So this is like a very real thing. These are not hypotheticals. And, I think everyone's quick to think of disability as being blind, but these are individuals that have, processing conditions, like cognitive processing conditions where, websites actually inadvertently cause harm. And then the other thing, and this goes a long way, make sure the page works if zoomed up to 400%. So, if y'all have learned about responsive web design here, this is a great example of how that does so much good in this area, because it'll shift over to its mobile kind of breakpoints. And if you're working with apps, provide the ability for an individual to use the phone's native text resize controls. Make sure that your text components in your apps respond to that. So the text content in your apps themselves can also increase in size. The other thing is, does it even need to be an app? Apps are complicated, websites are complicated. Are there alternate strategies for how you can kind of create something and give it to people in a way that they want it to be successful? When I was working with Alina, one of our clients wanted this whole huge complicated dashboard to like figure out inefficiencies for this complicated enterprise thing. And like to make a dashboard interactive like that, to make it accessible, to make it like actually usable to the people who use it, that's going to take hundreds of thousands of dollars and months of work. And then somebody has to stay and maintain it. And that's basically a full-time job. We talked to the people that would actually use this dashboard, and what they needed was an email sent twice a week. And that was significantly cheaper. It's not an app, it's just an email sent by a robot. And it just tells them some numbers that they need to know. And that's actually the more effective solution. And in terms of like an accessibility inclusive design mindset, we're not making assumptions about these individuals. We're talking to them to figure out what their needs are specifically, and then we're creating an accommodation for them. The final kind of thought here is, again, with intersectionality and inclusive kind of mindset, what is the evil version of your feature? By which I mean, how can somebody abuse this to make things worse for other people? There was a case recently where somebody was using an internal billing systems messaging property to basically stalk an employee. And that's not great. So, making sure that when you create these features, you take the time to think about how somebody could abuse it and what you can do to keep them from, doing that. So blocking and reporting features, making sure the company you work for has an escalation path to report this stuff. And Miguel, any ideas in active listening for disabled individuals? That is a lovely question. And actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to stop the share and turn on the camera. And to answer that question, active listening, I think, is a really great way to phrase it, which is I've heard the phrase basically be a walkie-talkie. You can either transmit or you can receive. So when somebody is taking the time to talk about their lived experiences with you, you listen, and you actively listen to what they have to say. And when they stop communicating, then it's your turn to ask clarifying information or to kind of comment on what they've told you. Because again, they're taking their own time and energy and expertise, and they're sharing it with you. And that's something you should be really aware of and kind of make sure you do it right. In terms of finding disabled individuals to speak with. There are professional testing groups such as Fable. There are also local places near me. There's a school you can go to if you are basically, if you're blind or have recently become blind, you learn how to navigate the world again. They have a really good community outreach program. A lot of individuals are actually usually pretty excited to talk to you, as long as you kind of set the stage ahead of time that like what you're trying to do is specifically make accommodations better, because disabled individuals historically are kind of cohorts of people who have been overlooked and kind of pushed out of society. So if you reach out directly to them to improve things, that's usually an exciting thing for them. The other thing is you don't really want to ask somebody directly about like their disabilities. Let them kind of frame it to you. It can be an extremely personal and an extremely rude question to say like, oh, how'd you lose your arm? That may resurface traumatic information in their life. And that may not be something they want to share with a complete stranger. So instead, like when you're doing usability testing or like kind of development testing, like let them tell you what's not working and why. And if that leads to a conversation about their disability, that's great. If not, they understand the parameters that they're coming in to speak with you. They don't explicitly need to do the work to tell you their life story about how they came to wind up in this situation. Yep, cameras on. That's a really good point, Rachel. One of my coworkers is deaf, and so she relies on auto transcription, but she also reads lips. And that's one of those things where like camera on or off is a whole weird thing to navigate in quarantine. But, if you know somebody there may need to see your lips moving and read your facial expressions to kind of help understand the content that you're trying to deliver. Yeah. How are we doing at time? Oh, we're just at time. I completely lost my sense of time in that talk. I apologize. Are there other questions I have a little bit more time if y'all do. I'm happy to answer more questions.
Yeah, so anybody feel free, it's 10 o'clock. So if you need to drop off, you can, but that's so generous. I guess Eric can stay on if anybody has more questions. Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, Alex, when trying to learn English, that's a really good, another thing. If you don't mind me monologuing for a second, English is a terrible language. It is very hard to learn. And another kind of, and this isn't specifically disability, although the correlation between minoritized groups and disability are oftentimes that's present because this is a bad society we live in. We had a project where we were working with SNAP benefits, and we were specifically doing outreach to language communities that were not being served. So Vietnamese, Chinese, Polish communities. And when I was talking about like how accessibility and inclusive design, like it's so important to make the obvious thing obvious. It's so important to use simple words. This is a really good example of it because, applying for SNAP benefits is this arduous thing. You have to give it so much information. And so we did a lot of work for like, what is the simplest way we can describe this? Because not everyone will go to the translated version of the app, because usually people use robo translators, which butcher it if you speak a second language and you feed it through Google Translate and you're like, that's not right at all. No. So they actually muddle through English because they think they're getting a better quality experience. A lot of individuals also thought that like this might be a scam, or they don't want to disclose the fact that they speak Vietnamese in their, as their primary language, because the government might do something with that. So this is another example of like how accessible design has this ripple effect where like we're not specifically designing for low-tech literate users or screen reader users, but these other groups are positively impacted by these kinds of considerations. We used web forms to collect all this information, and like simple language, as well as like really obvious error messaging also helped with getting people to, fill out deform using not their native language to ultimately to get SNAP benefits. So that's that, again, that's that ripple effect I talk about. It just sucks that English is what we speak because it makes no sense whatsoever. I think if we're wrapping up, I'm happy to answer more questions, but Rachel, I can give you a copy of these slides to pass around, and then they also have resources on the back half that include some of the automated code checkers I was mentioning, as well as other resources you can look up for like forums, as well as kind of accessible design considerations. And that's something I'd love to share with y'all if you'd like.
Yes, that would be amazing. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And thank you for the talk. This was so great and such good things to just keep in mind as we are all making different projects and websites and really need to like keep this very top of mind. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and if you'll permit me one last little piece of advice, this was on the slide that I breezed through. Every little bit helps. If you continue in your accessibility journey, there's a lot to learn, but fight that feeling that you need to be 100% perfect your first go. So every little bit, every little fix, every little thing you incorporate, that really helps people. And so like when I started my journey, I thought I had to get everything right. And that is just not a good way to get started. So just learn about one little concept. If you like it, implement it, keep that going if it feels good. And you have this compounding cumulative kind of thing that helps everyone.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I could not agree more. All of this was also so helpful for me as well, like keeping all of this in mind. Okay, great. Well, we can wrap up, but if people have